What if one day someone humiliated you, without imagining that you would still be the person with the power to decide their future? Mrs. Margaret, at 56 years old, always believed that effort was the path to being respected. That's why, for 17 years, she walked through the same door, at the same time, with the same tired smile, but full of honor. She was never late. She never let anyone down. She never asked for more than enough to live on. But that morning, a morning like any other, something changed. And it changed in a way she would never forget. She was organizing some reports when the new manager called her in. A young man, with expensive cologne and a gaze that had never learned to see people. Margaret didn't know it, but that call would be the blow that would divide her life into before and after. When he entered, he didn't even ask her to sit down. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't even raise his head to look at the person who had sustained that department for almost 2 decades. "The company is modernizing," he said, as if reading a random notice. "And there's no more room for people stuck in time." The phrase pierced Margaret like an arrow. She tried to take a deep breath. She tried to say she could adapt. She tried, with all possible dignity, to ask for at least a fair conversation. But he interrupted her. "It's simple. Sign here." And he pointed to the resignation form. Margaret held the pen with hands that had always worked without complaining. She signed with a broken heart, but without shedding a tear. She left in silence, her badge dangling between her fingers, as if it were the last piece of a story no one wanted to hear. In that corridor, she felt the weight of something she couldn't name. It wasn't just pain. It wasn't just injustice. It was as if, out of nowhere, the world had decided she was worthless. But what no one there imagined was that the door closing behind her wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something that, at that moment, even she couldn't believe. And the reason would only be discovered much later. If you want adjustments to the tone, more tension, more silence, more mystery, I can make it even more powerful. Do you want to keep it like this, or would you prefer an even more captivating hook? Margaret's story didn't begin the day she was fired. It began long before, in narrow streets, in small houses, and in silences that only strong women learn to endure. From a young age, Margaret was always the type of woman who believed in the power of hard work. She didn't have a long education. She didn't have opportunities. She didn't have anyone to open doors for her. What she did have was courage, the kind of courage that is born when life offers no choice. At 19, she was already supporting her own sick mother. At 22, she became pregnant by the only boyfriend she ever had, but ended up raising her son alone. The father disappeared before even knowing the child's name. And when the entire responsibility fell on her shoulders, she decided that she would never let her son lack anything, even if it meant lacking everything herself. That's how she got her first job at the company where she would stay for almost 2 decades. She started by understanding almost nothing. She didn't know how to use computers. She didn't know how to fill out reports. She didn't even know where to begin. But she had something that no one could teach her: willpower. And willpower, when it becomes routine, becomes competence. Over time, Margaret learned everything. Every department, every workflow, every problem that no one wanted to solve. She was always the one who found a solution. She was always the one who stayed late when someone gave up. She was always the one who got her hands dirty, even when it wasn't her job, even when her body begged for rest. Her older colleagues admired her, calling her the heart of the company. The younger ones, at the time, asked her for advice. And her previous bosses always said they trusted her more than many people with degrees. But the company changed. The management changed. The people changed. And little by little, Margaret began to realize that everything she carried, experience, loyalty, history, seemed worth less than a pretty resume or a rehearsed speech. Still, she stayed, not out of complacency, but out of love. That place was her second home. Every achievement she had in life came from there. Her first cell phone, her first sofa, her first trip with her son, her first peaceful Christmas after so many years of struggle. She saw colleagues come and go, saw departments close, saw digital changes that were frightening, but which she accepted to learn. Margaret wasn't afraid of the new. Her fear was different: being left behind. As she got older, She noticed glances that pierced her as if she were invisible. She also noticed little jokes about old people in the job market. She pretended not to hear, but she did. She pretended not to feel, but she did. Still, she kept arriving before everyone else. The doorman said that if she were ever late, he would think the world had ended, and she laughed, even when tired. Laughter was the armor of someone who had learned to survive without complaining. Her son, now an adult, insisted that she rest, but she always replied, "As long as I can work, I will work. I just want to be useful." And it was this desire to be useful that kept her going, even when fatigue weighed heavily on her shoulders. Then the new management arrived. Young, confident, with beautiful speeches about innovation, modernity, speed. What no one said aloud, but everyone understood, was the message behind those words. If you don't keep up, you're useless. It was around this time that the new manager took over. A man who knew numbers but didn't know people, who knew how to speak eloquently but didn't know how to listen, who only saw efficiency in reports, never in stories. He looked at Margaret as one observes an old piece of furniture that no longer matches the decor. He never asked what she did. He never asked how she could help. He simply began to ignore her, replacing her responsibilities, gradually taking away her space, like turning off the light in a room that still has people inside. And Margaret felt it. She felt it when they stopped calling her to meetings. She felt it when projects that were hers were given to interns. She felt it when her desk was moved to a corner, as if it were just an old filing cabinet. But what hurt the most wasn't the change. It was realizing that, for the first time, they were looking at her as if she were a problem, a piece that causes delays, a presence that bothers people. Even so, she tried to adapt. She tried to smile, to help, to show that she was there to contribute, not to compete. But it seemed that none of that made a difference. And while she tried not to fall apart, she carried with her the weight of a lifetime of dedication, dedicated to work, to her son, to survival, a life that never gave her rest, but which she embraced with dignity. And perhaps that's why the pain of being fired was so profound, because they didn't just take away her job, they took away the last thing she believed she still had, her worth. Before the terrible day that would change everything, Margaret spent weeks feeling the wind change, but without being able to see the whole storm. She noticed whispers, glances, rapid changes in what had once been routine. She noticed comments about restructuring, about cuts, about modernization. And her heart tightened with each phrase uttered in the air. But she didn't imagine it would be her. She never imagined it. Because deep down, she still believed that dedication was enough. She still believed that loyalty was seen. She still believed that a 17-year history couldn't be erased with a pen. But she discovered, the hard way, that in today's world, experience doesn't always mean protection. And that time is sometimes cruel to those who give too much. Carrying all this weight on her chest, Margaret walked towards the day that would change the course of her life. A day that would begin with humiliation, but would end up opening the way for the biggest turning point in her story. Margaret's routine was so marked by habit that it seemed almost a ritual. She woke up at 5 a.m. every day, even when her body begged for another hour of rest. She put the kettle on the stove, brewed the coffee slowly, and drank the first cup looking out the window, where the street was still asleep. There, in that small silence before the chaos of the day, she took a deep breath, gathered her strength, and gave thanks for having another job to do. Then she took the same bus, sat on the same seat, and saw the same people, almost all young, going to their jobs or universities. Sometimes she looked at them and remembered when she had that same gleam of future in her eyes, even though she had never had the same opportunities as them. Upon arriving at the company, she was always the first to leave. The cleaning still smelled of the early morning. Some of the lights were still off, and she liked that. She liked that feeling of preparing the ground before everything began. Organizing papers, reviewing schedules, updating spreadsheets, making coffee ready. It was as if she were taking care of an entire organism, making it function before others noticed. For many years, this was seen. It was recognized. The former bosses used to say, "If Margaret is absent, nothing gets done." But those same bosses left, retired, or replaced. And with them went the recognition. the recognition she never asked for, but always valued. The new manager, upon taking over, brought with him a young team full of energy and ideas. At first, Margaret was happy. She thought she would learn from them, that she could add experience to the newness. But she soon realized that she wasn't treated as someone important. She was treated as someone outdated, as if she were a burden the company carried by tradition. In the first few days, they tried to show patience. They smiled kindly. They asked if she needed help learning the new systems. But the friendliness quickly turned to arrogance. The questions became impatient sighs. The help turned into malicious comments, said as jokes. She doesn't understand these modern things. Poor thing, she can't keep up. She should think about retiring soon. Margaret heard it all. She didn't confront it because she didn't want to cause trouble. She just kept it inside, burying the pain deep in her chest. Over time, the manager began to take away her responsibilities. First, small reports, then internal meetings, then the leadership of the processes she had been following for years. Her desk was moved. Before, it was firmly next to the department. Now, it was in a corner where no one could see her. It seemed like a simple decision, but it was a clear message. You are no longer part of the center. You are being pushed out. Even so, she tried to adapt. She arrived even earlier, studied some tools she found difficult on her own, took notes, watched videos to learn. The fear of losing her job made her hands tremble at night, but it also motivated her to continue. And amidst this silent effort, she noticed something else. Her younger colleagues no longer looked her in the eye. It was as if they had learned to see her the same way the manager did, as a relic of the past. And that hurt. It hurt more than losing tasks. It hurt more than being pushed to the sidelines. It hurt because, inside, she was still the same woman who had solved so many problems, the same one who had kept that company afloat for so many years. No one seemed to remember that she was the living memory of that place. In the hallways, she heard whispers about restructuring, cuts, cultural change, and her heart ached because she knew those words were never good for someone over 50. And every time there was something new, she realized she was the last to know. It was as if they were preparing the ground to remove her from the scene, but without the courage to say it directly. Still, she tried to remain useful. She continued solving small problems that no one saw, things that seemed simple, but that only worked because she did them. It was just her. When someone needed to find an old document, it was her. When a system crashed unexpectedly, it was her. When a client called furiously demanding explanations, it was her. When the manager couldn't find an important paper, she was the one who solved it. But none of that was noticed. No one thanked her. No one acknowledged her. And however strong she was, Margaret felt her heart grow weary. Sometimes, while tidying her desk, she thought about the past. The day her son got sick, and she had to take the computer to the hospital, working beside his bed so as not to lose her job. The old boss who said she was irreplaceable. The day she received an Internal Employee of the Year award, 20 years ago. These memories kept her standing, but they also made the fall seem even more unfair. The new manager, with his expensive clothes and sharp words, saw none of that. He only saw numbers. He saw deadlines. He saw goals. He saw change. And when he spoke to her, it was always in the same tone, like someone talking to someone who is delaying the process. Margaret, what you do, any software can do. Margaret, you need to understand that things have changed. Margaret, we can't keep teaching you everything. She would take a deep breath, answer calmly, and try to learn. But she would arrive home crying. Her son, now an adult, would ask if everything was all right, and she would answer, "Yes, my son. It's just tiredness." But it wasn't tiredness. It was fear. It was the feeling of being slowly erased. It was the weight of age being used as a weapon against her. Her older colleagues were also being sidelined. Some had already been fired, others had given up. And Margaret watched this like someone who sees a line moving forward and knows her turn is coming. Still, she had hope. Perhaps it was naivete. Perhaps it was too much kindness. Perhaps it was just the difficulty of accepting that, after so many years, she was being treated as disposable. And this became even more evident when the company started organizing strategic meetings to which she was never invited. The new manager would say, "These are guidelines for the new phase of the company." And Margaret understood, not because she wasn't capable, but because they no longer wanted her there. Even so, she remained steadfast. She arrived early. She did what she could. She kept to herself the pain that grew daily. And it was in this climate of silent tension, of disguised fear, of increasing loneliness, that she began to feel that something was about to happen. She didn't yet know what, but she knew it was coming. She knew the storm was already brewing. She knew the whispers about change had a specific target. And when she realized that people no longer asked how she was, that the manager barely looked at her face, that her tasks were disappearing day after day, then her heart understood. They were preparing her departure, and she was being pushed to the end of a story she helped build. But Margaret still couldn't imagine the magnitude of the humiliation that was to come, that cruel, cold, calculated moment that would take from her not only her job, but something much deeper, the feeling of belonging. And it would be precisely this blow that would pave the way for the most unexpected turning point in her life. Margaret's dismissal didn't happen suddenly. It wasn't an accident, nor an administrative error. It was calculated. It was prepared in silence. It was simmering for weeks until the day they decided to serve her complete humiliation, and she would be forced to swallow it all with dignity. That Monday began like any other. She woke up early, had her coffee looking at the still dark street, packed her bag, put on the simple coat that already knew her body, and headed to the bus stop. The routine, as always, gave her a comfort that no one saw. It was there, in the automatic flow of the days, that she found some security. But that morning, there was something different in the air. It wasn't just a premonition. It was as if the world was heavier, as if each step to the company was a step she wished she could postpone. When she arrived, she noticed that the lights were already on, something unusual because she was always the first. In the hallway, she saw 2 employees whispering and pretending not to notice when she passed. In the break room, the manager didn't greet her. He only looked up and went back to his cell phone. The feeling of unease intensified. She tried to ignore it, as she always did when something hurt her. She sat at her desk, organized papers that were no longer even her responsibility, and tried to focus on the little she still had left to do, until the internal phone rang. It was the manager's voice, cold, quick, expressionless. "Margaret, can you come to my office?" She took a deep breath. She knew that call was inevitable. The tone didn't ask for conversation. It demanded closure. She stood up slowly, adjusted her blouse as if trying to adjust her own heart, and walked down the corridor that seemed narrower than ever. Each step echoed like a cruel reminder that something big and bad was about to happen. When she entered the manager's office, he didn't ask her to sit down. He didn't smile. He didn't offer her water. He didn't even take his eyes off the monitor at first. He just pushed some papers across the table as if he were getting rid of something dirty. "Sit down, if you want," he said, without looking at her. The words, "if you want," stung. They weren't kindness. They were disguised contempt. Margaret sat down. The manager took a deep breath, as if preparing a rehearsed speech. "The company is going through changes," he began, in the same tone he used in meetings. "We need to modernize, and that includes cutting costs and renewing our staff." She didn't say anything. She just waited. "And," he continued, adjusting his tie, "unfortunately, we no longer have room for people who don't keep up with the current pace. People, not employees, much less you. People," as if she were a type and not an individual. Margaret felt her stomach sink. Even so, she tried to keep her voice steady. "I can learn. I'm trying. I can improve, if that's what you need." He raised his hand, cutting her off, like silencing a child. "Margaret, please, don't make this difficult." And then came the phrase that would tear her soul apart for the next few months. "The company doesn't have room for outdated people." That was it. Outdated. As if she were an old object, worthless, out of place, useless. Margaret felt her throat tighten, but she held back the tears with all her might. I worked here for 17 years, she said, her voice almost failing. "I know this company better than—" "Time passes," he interrupted again, "and the company needs to keep up. Don't take it personally. Don't take it personally." It was impossible not to. The manager then pushed the dismissal paper toward her along with an ordinary pen. No prior human warning, no real conversation, nothing. He simply said, "Sign." Margaret looked at the paper as if she were witnessing her own history being erased. The letters seemed distant, as if they didn't belong to her. Still, her hands, trembling, cold, held the pen. Before signing, she tried one last time. "After everything I've done, after so long, is this how it ends?" The manager, finally looking her in the eye, replied with the coldness of someone who had never known what effort was. "Employees come and go. The company remains." That sentence was like a slap without a hand, a slap of contempt, a slap of erasure. Margaret signed, not because she wanted to, but because the choice had already been made by them before even calling her. When she returned the pen, she realized that her hands were trembling so much that the tip scratched the paper. The manager didn't comment. He simply collected the document as if putting away trash. "You can hand in your badge at reception," he said, looking back at the computer. "Your dismissal is immediate." Immediate, as if they were ripping off a bandage abruptly, caring little about the wound underneath. She stood up slowly. Each movement seemed heavy, costly, as if her whole body were fighting against the urge to collapse right there. As she left the room, she heard hurried footsteps, doors slamming, conversations that ceased when she approached. Some colleagues pretended to be busy, others simply looked away. Only two people, two whom she had patiently taught when they were interns, gave her a sad but helpless look. They said nothing, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of shame. At reception, she handed over her badge. The young employee, with perfect nails and a hurried look, simply said, "Sign here, please." "No, I'm sorry." "No, thank you." No acknowledgement. Margaret signed again, and when she returned the badge, she felt as if she were handing over a huge part of herself. Not just a plastic card, but the identity she had carried for almost 2 decades. As she walked through the glass door for the last time, she realized the air seemed colder, her heart heavier, the ground more distant. It was as if the world had become bigger and crueler in an instant. She didn't know where to go. She didn't know what to say when she got home. She didn't know how to tell her son she was unemployed. She only knew that, at that moment, everything seemed lost. She walked to the bus stop, trying to stay strong, but her legs trembled. Halfway there, the first tear fell, then the second, then all of them, and she stopped, leaned against a random wall, and cried. She cried like she hadn't cried in years. She cried for what she had lost, for what they had given her, for what they had taken away. She cried for the injustice. She cried for the accumulated exhaustion. She cried because life sometimes weighs too heavily on those who only tried to do the right thing. When she got home, she sat on the sofa, and for the first time in a long time, allowed herself to feel the full extent of the pain. She didn't speak. She didn't call anyone. She didn't turn on the light. She just stayed there, hugging herself, like someone trying to put the pieces back together. At that moment, she believed she had reached the end. But unknowingly, that end would only be the beginning of a turning point that no one, absolutely no one, could have predicted. In the days that followed her dismissal, Margaret experienced an emptiness she had never felt before. It wasn't just the lack of a job, it was the lack of identity. It was as if they had ripped away the last place where she still felt needed. She woke up at the same time as always, 5 in the morning, but now the house was silent. There was no hurry, no routine, no destination. Her body, accustomed to functioning like a machine, seemed lost, not knowing what to do with so much silence. The coffee, which once tasted of hope, now tasted of fear. She sat at the table and looked out the window, but saw nothing. It was as if life had darkened, even with the sun streaming through the curtains. The world continued happening outside, but inside her, everything was still. Her son noticed, of course. He asked if everything was all right, and she answered with the same smile she had practiced her whole life to hide the pain. "It's just tiredness, my son. It will pass." But it wasn't passing. She tried to get through the day as best she could. She tidied the house calmly. She washed the dishes twice, even unnecessarily. She organized drawers that didn't need organizing. She rummaged through old boxes just to keep her hands busy. When the silence became unbearable, she would go out and walk to the market, buying one or two small things just to have the feeling that she was still part of the world. But even in those moments, something hurt, because people passed by hurriedly, confidently, while she felt her future had been ripped away. The afternoons were the worst. It was the time when, before, she answered dozens of calls, solved problems, organized tasks. Now the clock seemed to mock her, ticking too slowly. When she tried to rest, her brain wouldn't let her. The scenes of the dismissal came back repeatedly, as if her mind were replaying them to torture her. The manager's voice echoed, "We don't have room for outdated people." The sound of the pen scratching the paper. The moment he handed over his badge. The cold, calculated, impersonal look. Each memory was a stab in the back. At night, when the silence deepened, she cried again. She cried softly, so as not to worry her son, but she cried with the pain of someone who had carried the world on her shoulders for 17 years and was discarded as if she were trash. In the first few days, Margaret tried to find a job. She posted her resume on websites she barely knew how to use. She went to a few interviews where they looked at her with the same expression the manager had used. "You're no longer needed." Sometimes they didn't even say that. They just analyzed her age, sighed, and ended the interview with, "We'll be in touch." But they never did. She knew. The world of work isn't kind to mature women, and she felt it with every closed door. Little by little, she began to isolate herself. She didn't answer calls from friends. She didn't go to Sunday gatherings anymore. She didn't have the strength to hear questions like, "But why did they fire you? Didn't you try to talk? Didn't you have job security?" Each question would be a reminder of what she tried to forget. Only one friend, Ruth, persisted. Ruth was the type who wouldn't accept "I'm fine" as an answer. She would appear at the door unannounced, with a bag of cheese bread and a sincere hug that almost melted Margaret. "You seem very down," Ruth would say. "Talk to me." What really happened? Margaret tried to deflect, saying it was just a difficult moment, that it would resolve itself soon. Ruth, however, insisted. "I know your look. You've been hurt. Someone hurt you deeply." And it was true. The dismissal hadn't just been a financial loss. It had been a moral wound. Margaret could only sleep when emotional exhaustion overcame her. But even in her sleep, she dreamed of corridors, doors closing, voices repeating, outdated, dispensable, end of a cycle. Until one afternoon, desperate to find something to do, she went to the old cabinet in the living room, the one where she kept albums, old documents, notebooks, and memories she avoided touching. There, among yellowed sheets and plastic folders, she found a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside, there were notes, small studies, loose ideas, projects she herself had created during her years at the company, ideas she never presented, for fear of not being heard. They were improved processes, organizational suggestions, detailed workflows that had worked when she improvised. As she flipped through those pages, something inside her stirred. A thread, a breath, a remnant of faith she didn't even know still existed. She realized that, even being treated as disposable, she had accumulated knowledge that no one could erase. No manager could steal it. No dismissal could invalidate it. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. A phrase echoed in her mind, not as a preformed thought, but as a seed sprouting. Maybe I wasn't at the end. Maybe I was being reborn. That night, Margaret picked up her notes and began to reread each page. With each definition, each idea, each process she herself had created, something inside her reconnected with the strength that life had tried to extinguish. She spent hours there, her heart restless, but alive. The silence of the house no longer seemed so suffocating. For the first time since being fired, she felt she had something real, that she could still offer. It wasn't just knowledge, it was history, it was experience, it was value. And it was precisely at that moment, on that silent night, amidst old papers and cold coffee, that the turning point began, not in the outside world, but within her. The fall still hurt, but the seed of reaction had been planted, and nothing would be the same after that. Margaret's life change didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like in the movies, where one door closes and another opens immediately. In real life, change comes slowly, silently, almost imperceptibly, until the day it explodes. After finding her old ideas and notes, Margaret spent days carefully rereading everything. She realized with growing surprise that those ideas were good, very good. They were solutions she herself had created for problems the company faced, but which had never been presented because she always felt she wasn't important enough to give her opinion. The notes were there as a living reminder of how much she knew and how much she had never been valued. Deep down, something inside her lit up, a small but steady glow, a glow she hadn't felt in a long time. One night, while reviewing one of those folders, she remembered Marcos, a former colleague who had left the company before the new management. He hadn't left because he was fired. He'd left because he received a better offer at a smaller but promising company. He always told her, "Margaret, if you had the opportunity, you'd change any business. You're more than you think." At the time, she laughed. She thought it was an exaggeration. She thought it was affection. She never thought it was true. But now, with the ideas before her, she began to doubt her own disbelief. Driven by something between courage and desperation, she decided to message Marcos. A simple sentence. "Do you have a minute? I need to talk." He replied almost immediately. "Sure. Want to call?" The two spoke on the phone that same night. Margaret told him, in a low, timid voice, that she had been fired. Marcos was indignant. Genuinely so. "How could they fire you? You were the backbone of that place." Margaret smiled awkwardly, but explained that she was now trying to figure out what to do with her own life. That's when he asked, "Can I see your notes? Remember that project you mentioned years ago? The one that said it would improve productivity? Do you still have it?" She hesitated. They were just loose ideas, not complete projects. Still, she mustered her courage and sent photos of the pages. Marcos remained silent for long minutes. Then he replied, "Margaret, this is brilliant. It's not good. It's brilliant. It's exactly the kind of thing we're looking for at the company." She concluded automatically, "But I don't have an education." "And who said education replaces experience?" Marcos retorted. "What you have here is real, practical knowledge. Knowledge that many large companies pay dearly to acquire." The phrase echoed in her head. Marcos insisted that she present the ideas to the new director of the company where he worked. He said he trusted her, that he believed in her abilities more than the arrogant manager ever believed in any employee. After much hesitation, fear, and sleepless nights, Margaret accepted. On the day of the meeting, she trembled from head to toe. She wore her best clothes, simple but clean, and carried a folder full of the ideas she had kept for so many years. While waiting in the reception area, she felt her heart pounding in her neck. Each second seemed like an eternity. But when she entered the room, she found the director, a calm man with a kind gaze, unlike anything she had faced at her old company. He asked to see her notes. He slowly leafed through everything while she waited with her hands clasped, holding back her anxiety. After a few minutes, the director closed the folder and said, "How come nobody ever valued this?" Margaret didn't answer. She didn't know how to answer. She was afraid that if she said anything, her voice would fail her. The director continued, "Marcos spoke very highly of you, but this speaks even more." He took a deep breath. "Margaret, have you ever thought about turning this into a business?" She blinked. She thought she had misheard. "A business?" she repeated, almost voiceless. "Yes," he smiled. "A consulting service. Training. We organize your ideas. Structure everything. Create a product. I can invest. You provide the knowledge, I provide the capital." Margaret was speechless. It was too surreal. It was too hard to believe that, after everything, she was receiving an opportunity, not out of pity, not out of charity, but out of merit. "Me?" she asked, still in disbelief. "Me? Start a company? Why not?" He replied simply. "You have the most important thing, the experience that nobody teaches." The phrase hit her hard, like a hug, like a reminder, like an awakening. And that's how, weeks later, Margaret signed her first official contract as a consultant. Insecure, yes. Nervous, always. But determined. It was a slow, painful reconstruction, full of sleepless nights, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, something was truly hers. The small consulting firm became an office. The office became a team. The team became a name in the market. And the name became a reference. Margaret was growing, not because she wanted to prove something to the arrogant manager, but because for the first time, she had discovered her own worth. Meanwhile, the company that had fired her was beginning to sink. Delayed projects, poorly executed processes, internal problems, demotivated employees. The modernization that the manager so strongly advocated had become a directionless chaos. Without someone like Margaret, who was the invisible foundation, the company began to crumble. Months later, news broke that the company was in financial trouble and needed to sell some of its shares to survive. Margaret heard the news with a mixture of surprise and silent pain. Not out of revenge, but because she knew it was a logical consequence of the arrogance of someone who doesn't value experience. A few days later, she received an unexpected call. It was the former owner of the company, the one who hadn't participated in the new management, but who still owned shares. He already knew her by sight and knew of her competence, but he had never imagined that she had started her own business. "Margaret, I've heard about your work, and I heard your consulting firm is growing rapidly," she confirmed shyly. "I have a proposition," he said. "The old company is for sale, and I think you're the only person capable of saving it." Margaret was speechless. It was impossible. It was too big. It was unbelievable. But the man was serious. He wanted to sell his shares to her, on terms she could afford in partnership with the current investor. The words echoed like an impossible dream. "You are the only one capable of saving what we once built." Margaret spent nights thinking. She was afraid. She had doubts. She had deep scars. But she also had something she didn't have before: vision, strength, courage. And, with the support of Marcos, the director investor, and her own accumulated experience of 17 years, she decided to accept. On the day she signed the purchase papers, her hand trembled. Not from insecurity, but from the intensity of everything her life had become. She, the woman they considered outdated, was buying the company that had discarded her. And then, weeks later, she returned. Not as an employee, not as a subordinate, not as someone to be humiliated. She returned as the new owner. When she walked through the glass door, she felt the same cold air as last time. But now it didn't hurt. It was the air of justice, of change, of victory that doesn't need shouting. The arrogant manager was at reception, talking to someone. When he saw her, he turned pale. He looked at her as if seeing a ghost or an inevitable destiny. Margaret simply said, "Can we talk in my new office?" And he understood, in that same instant, that life takes turns, big turns, painful turns, turns that make the world spin until everyone reaps exactly what they sowed. That day, Margaret didn't feel vengeful. She felt free. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into strength. And the strength hadn't come from hatred, but from rebirth. She didn't want to destroy anyone. She only wanted a safe place to finally be who she always was. And now, she had it. The company seemed smaller when Margaret returned, perhaps because she was bigger. Perhaps because, for the first time, she saw everything with a different clarity. Without fear, without submission, without the weight she had carried for so many years. The corridors that once felt cramped now seemed spacious. The walls that once swallowed her were now just walls. Nothing there had power over her anymore. Only memories, and memories don't control anyone when the soul is at peace. The arrogant manager, Lucas, entered behind her, unsure where to put his hands. His former haughty posture had vanished. He seemed smaller, shrunken, as if he had suddenly realized he never truly knew who she was. Margaret invited him to sit. The room that had once belonged to him was now hers. But she didn't insist on sitting in the chair of power. She sat in an ordinary, simple chair. He felt uncomfortable. The silence between them lasted a few seconds. Seconds that, to Lucas, seemed like years. Finally he spoke, his voice choked with emotion. "I didn't know that you," he swallowed hard, "that you had all this potential." Margaret didn't react arrogantly. She didn't smile slightly. She didn't need to show victory. She simply replied calmly, "You never asked. You never observed. You never wanted to know. And when we don't see the other person, we end up thinking that only our own reflection exists." Lucas lowered his eyes. It was impossible to hold her gaze at that moment. "I was wrong," he said sincerely. "I was ignorant, arrogant, and I treated you in a way that no one should be treated. I'm sorry." Margaret took a deep breath, not out of anger, out of liberation. "I accept your apology," she said, "but I'm not going back to the past. What you did hurt, and it hurt a lot, but I'm not going to carry this weight forever. Forgiveness isn't to relieve you. It's for me to continue living inside." That dismantled Lucas. He expected a scolding, a speech, perhaps even humiliation. He didn't expect maturity. He didn't expect greatness. Margaret continued, "You'll stay here if you want, not because I need you, but because I want to transform this company into something different. A place where no one goes through what I went through, where no one is discarded because of age or appearance, where people are seen as people, not as numbers." He nodded, embarrassed. Margaret stood up, approached the window, and looked out at the courtyard where she had once walked as an invisible figure. Now, in that same place, she was present. The change began quietly, like everything she did. She called each employee, one by one, to talk, not to investigate, not to correct, to listen. She heard stories she never imagined. Older employees, fearful of being replaced. Young employees, insecure and without guidance. People who had never done a good job. People who worked while sick. People who felt disposable. Margaret realized that more than a company, this was an emotional battlefield, and she knew exactly how to transform it. Not with force, not with shouting, not with threats, but with humanity. The same humanity that had almost been ripped from her. She created flexible schedules. She created training programs for those who were afraid of new technologies. She created discussion groups, internal courses, monthly recognition. She created something she had never found there: respect. To the younger ones, she would say, "You have energy, that's beautiful, but don't forget, the brilliance you have today, we also had once, and one day you will need the patience you think you'll never lack." To the older ones, "You are not the past, you are pillars. Without you, there is no history, and without history, there is no future." The company changed, the atmosphere changed, the people changed, and Margaret changed with them. The former manager, Lucas, began working under her supervision, and curiously, he became one of the most disciplined. For the first time in his life, he understood the value of listening before deciding. One day, weeks after the transition, he entered her office with an envelope in his hands. "I wanted to," he took a deep breath, "thank you for the second chance. You had no reason to, but you gave it anyway." Margaret smiled slightly. "I didn't give it to you. I gave it to the company. And I gave it to myself. When we forgive, we open space to continue living." He stood there, absorbing every word. "Thank you," he repeated. She nodded simply. She didn't need to say anything more. At the end of the day, when everyone had left, Margaret walked alone through the company. Every corner seemed different now. She stopped in front of the door to the room where she had been humiliated months before. The door was ajar. She pushed it open slowly and entered. The room was empty, silent, illuminated only by the dim light of the late afternoon. And for the first time, she didn't feel pain there. She felt victory, not a noisy, vengeful, or proud victory, but the silent victory of someone who survived. The room was no longer a place of downfall. It was the landmark of her rise. And looking at that small space, she thought, "Here they knocked me down, and right here I got up." She closed the door, took a deep breath, and headed for the elevator. Now, she had an entire company to rebuild, a new life, a respected name, and, for the first time in a long time, she had peace. At the end of that journey, as the company lights went out and silence filled the building that had once rejected her, Margaret understood something she had spent a lifetime learning. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And those who don't earn it, sooner or later, learn it through life. She held no hatred. She harbored no resentment. She carried no vengeance in her heart. What she carried was something lighter, and at the same time more powerful. The certainty that no one, absolutely no one, has the right to diminish a person's story just because it seems too simple to be seen. Margaret discovered, in the hardest way possible, that in many parts of the world, someone's worth isn't measured by effort, loyalty, or dedication, but by appearance, by age, by the ability to be replaced. And that's precisely why her turnaround was so significant. Because she proved, first to herself, then to everyone, that those who build with their own hands never lose their footing. That woman who was dismissed as if she were dust on a table returned like a wind that changes the destiny of an entire place. And her story leaves a deep mark. There are people who only see the brilliance of youth, but the brightest light often comes from those who have burned inside and rebuilt themselves, millimeter by millimeter. There are people who laugh at the fragility of others, but they forget that time exacts its price for every laugh born of cruelty. There are people who fire without imagining that they are liberating. There are doors that close so that others may open as wide as the world. And Margaret, with her unwavering calm, her silent dignity, and her unseen strength, left behind a lesson worth more than any position, title, or wall with her name engraved on it. True greatness lies not in those who rise quickly, but in those who get up after being knocked down. The company changed, the environment changed, the people changed, but above all, she changed. And that's what transforms any destiny. Not what they do to you, but what you do with the pain they tried to inflict on you. Listener, viewer, reader, perhaps you know someone who has gone through, or is going through, this. Perhaps you yourself have been humiliated, forgotten, discarded. If so, remember this. No one can erase a woman who was born to illuminate her own path, and no age is too late to start over. Now tell me, have you ever been humiliated at work because of your age, or by someone who knew nothing about your story? I want to hear from you. And before you go, remember, comment, like, and follow our channel and become part of this community of women who overcome the difficulties and adversities that fate puts in our path. Every day, we bring real stories, stories that inspire, strengthen, and prove that none of us are alone.